I wasn't looking for a riddle. I was looking for a ventilation shaft. This is important to understand, because everything that followed began with a completely mundane question, one to which I had no answer. I was standing outside an apartment building in the center of a European city, next to the metro entrance, and looking at the basement wall. A ventilation grill protruded from it. Not decorative, not for show. It was technical, cast iron, with a characteristic cross-section, the kind used to exhaust air from underground tunnels. The building, according to the plaque, was built in 1882. The metro line beneath it was officially built in 1935. A 53-year difference. I thought it was a reconstruction, that the shaft had been cut in later, during the tunnel's construction. It was a logical explanation, and I was prepared to accept it. But then I looked at the masonry around the grill. It was intact. The brick lay flat, with no sign of being opened or resealed. The grating sat in the wall as if it had been laid in place along with it, as if whoever built this building in 1882 already knew there would be a tunnel underneath, or knew there already was one. I did what I always do when something doesn't add up. I started checking other buildings, and I discovered this wasn't an isolated incident. In dozens of cities, on different continents, the subway infrastructure is strangely intertwined with the foundations of buildings that, according to official chronology, predate the tunnels themselves by 30, 50, sometimes 70 years. Air vents are built into walls that no one has ever opened. The supporting structures of the stations rest on foundations that were supposedly laid for entirely different purposes, as if the buildings above and the system below were elements of the same project, the same blueprint, the same design. I'm not claiming that this was the case. I'm saying, I'm standing in front of a wall with a cast iron grate that sits there as if it's always been there. And I have no explanation that doesn't raise more questions than it answers. After that incident with the ventilation grate, I began to pay attention to something most metro passengers take for granted: depth. We descend underground every day and don't ask ourselves the simplest question: why so deep? I started collecting figures, and the more I collected, the less logical they became. Arsenalna station in Kiev is 15.5 meters below the surface. That's deeper than a 30-story building. St. Petersburg metro stations are 60, 70, and some 80 meters deep. Certain sections of the London Tube run at depths for which there's no rational engineering justification. I know the standard answer by heart, having heard it dozens of times. Geology, groundwater, the need to pass beneath riverbeds. And yes, sometimes that's true, but geology explains specific sections, not the global trend. And here's the trend. I checked. Modern metro lines, built in the 21st century using the latest generation of tunnel boring machines, are being built significantly shallower than stations built 50, 80, or even 100 years ago. Technology has become more powerful. Materials have become stronger. Engineering calculations have become more precise. But the depth has decreased. It's reverse logic. It's as if each successive generation of builders has risen closer to the surface, moving away from whatever lies beneath. There's a second argument, the one most often cited: bomb shelters. Deep stations were designed with military use in mind. But here too the chronology doesn't hold up. Many of the deepest stations were built, or at least designed, before the threat of aerial bombardment became a real factor in urban planning. Projects were approved in the years when strategic bombing doctrine didn't even exist as a concept. And yet, someone decided to dig 100 meters down. Why? For whom? I don't need an answer right now. I need the question to be asked, because it's almost never heard. We take depth for granted as a technical parameter, but a parameter is always someone's decision, and I want to understand who made it and what they knew about what had already existed at that depth before. Let's say the depth is explainable. Let's say I accept the arguments about geology, groundwater, and military doctrine, even those that don't align with the chronology. let's say so. But then explain something else to me. Explain marble to me. I descended into a Moscow metro station. One of those opened in 1935, at the height of industrialization, in a country where peasants still remembered famine, and stopped in the middle of the hall. Ceiling vaults, smalt mosaic panels, columns faced with marble transported from the Urals for thousands of kilometers, bronze chandeliers, each weighing several hundred kilograms. I stood in a transportation hub, in a place whose sole function was to channel the flow of people from one point to another. And this place looked like a cathedral. I know the official explanation. Palaces for the people. The ideology of a new state that wanted to show the working class that beauty belonged to them. It's a beautiful thought. I'm not disputing the intent. I'm disputing the logistics. Because cladding the 46 stations of the first phase with marble requires more than just quarries and trains. You need stonecutters, polishers, mosaicists, craftsmen whose skills are honed over decades. And they're needed by the thousands, simultaneously, in a country that experienced civil war 14 years ago. Where did they come from? But something else stopped me. Not Moscow. Moscow, at least, can be explained by ideology. I was stopped by Stockholm, where the metro stations are carved out of rock and left in their original state, like caves, as if someone had discovered underground cavities and simply restored them. I was stopped by New York, by City Hall Station, closed in 1945, with its stained glass ceilings and tiled arches of such complexity that they're compared to Romanesque churches. I stopped in Budapest, where the line opened in 1896 looks less like a late 19th century engineering project than like a careful restoration of something much older. Different countries, different decades, different political systems, and the same inexplicable excess, the same architectural logic that has nothing to do with passenger transportation. I can accept that one country decided to build palaces underground. 2, a coincidence. But when the same signature style is found on 4 continents, in cities unconnected by culture, ideology, or engineering school, it's no longer a style. It's a trace. I decided to check the simplest thing. Dates. Not architecture, not materials, not depth. I simply took the official construction dates for the first metro lines in several cities and placed them next to the announced scope of work. And here, for the first time, I felt truly uneasy. The Moscow Metro, the decision to build, 1931. The grand opening of the first line, 1935. 4 years. In 4 years, under conditions of early industrialization, with a shortage of qualified engineers in the absence of mass-produced tunnel boring equipment, more than 11 kilometers of tunnels were dug. 13 stations were built, tracks were laid, ventilation, lighting, and drainage systems were installed, and each station was finished as if it were the foyer of an opera house. 4 years. London, the Metropolitan Line, 1863. The tunnels were dug using open-cut mining right through the center of the world's largest city, through existing streets, through sewers, through the foundations of residential buildings. Even historians loyal to the official version use the word ambitious when describing the stated timeframes. Paris, the first line to the World's Fair in 1900. 10 kilometers of tunnels beneath the historic center in 2 years. Under the Seine, beneath medieval buildings, beneath layers that should, in theory, require archaeological supervision at every meter. 2 years. I'm not an engineer, but I can read construction documents. And here's what I noticed when I tried to find detailed progress reports. Construction photographs, those that have survived and are available in archives, oddly depict completed spaces more often than the process of their creation. Workers stand inside completed tunnels, posing against the backdrop of the laid vaults. Excavation, formwork, and concrete pouring, the stages that take up the bulk of any underground construction project, are depicted sparingly, fragmentarily, as if the camera only appeared after the main work was already done, or when the main work was done by someone else, long before the camera came along. Everything I've described so far, the depth, the architecture, the time frame, can be explained if desired. It's a stretch, with caveats, but it can be done. However, there's one fact that explanations are the worst at explaining. Beneath most major cities in the Old World, extensive underground spaces already existed long before anyone even uttered the word metro, and the scale of these spaces defies the functions ascribed to them. The Paris catacombs, officially former quarries. The total length of documented tunnels is about 300 kilometers. 300. That's the distance from Paris to London, and we're told it was all carved out for limestone mining. Granted. But why would a quarry need arched vaults? Why would it need a regular layout with intersections that meet at right angles? Why would it need ventilation shafts, positioned with engineering precision to ensure air circulation at a depth of 20 meters? A quarry is a hole in the ground from which stone is extracted. It's not an underground city, but what lies beneath Paris resembles a city, Naples. Every major construction project in the historic center stumbles upon cavities, passages, chambers, galleries extending tens of meters underground. They are discovered, briefly described, sometimes photographed. Then they fill with concrete, and work continues. Edinburgh. A network of rooms comparable in area to the above-ground buildings has been discovered beneath the Old Town, Budapest. Buda stands on a labyrinth of underground passages, some of which are used as tourist attractions, while others are closed without explanation. And here's what haunts me. When metro construction began in these cities, the designers inevitably encountered something already underground. Not a void, not soil, a structure. An organized space with signs of engineering. And every time, the reaction was the same. Classify it as a quarry, a cellar, a medieval sewer, assign an innocuous label. Move on. I can't prove that the metro runs through existing tunnels, but I can show that the tunnels were there before the metro, and that no one has ever convincingly explained who built them or why. There's a detail that bothers me more than depth, more than marble, more than deadlines. It's a technical detail, invisible to passengers, but obvious to anyone who's ever worked with engineering documentation. The technologies used to build the first subways have no pedigree. Let me explain what I mean. Any engineering technology goes through a process. First, an idea, then a prototype, then a failure, then refinement, another failure, another refinement. Years of trials, unsuccessful decisions, collapses, leaks, design revisions. That's how engineering works. That's how it's always worked. Except for the subway, the waterproofing of the tunnels under the Thames, completed in the 1860s. Modern engineers who have studied these designs use the phrase, surprisingly mature for their time. Not primitive, not experimental, mature. As if whoever designed them already knew what works and what doesn't. As if the error phase had been passed somewhere else, or at another time. The ventilation systems of early London Underground lines. They were designed for air exchange rates that presuppose an understanding of the aerodynamics of enclosed spaces, a science that took shape as a formalized discipline decades later. Someone designed the movement of airflows in underground tunnels before humanity had the mathematical apparatus to describe them, or they used apparatus we don't know about. The acoustics of the vaults of individual Moscow metro stations. I spoke with people who work in architectural acoustics professionally. They say the arch shapes in some stations are optimized for sound absorption in a way that is achieved today using computer modeling. Computer modeling didn't exist in 1935. So either Soviet engineers possessed intuition bordering on genius, or they weren't working from a blank slate. The pattern is the same in every city I've examined. Technologies appear immediately in their final form. No drafts, no evolution. Without a documented chain of command from concept to implementation. It's as if someone opened a folder of completed drawings and handed them over to people who faithfully built what was drawn up, without asking questions about where the drawings came from. Until that point, I'd been looking at each city separately. London is a different story. Moscow is a different story. Paris, Budapest, New York, each with its own chronology, its own geology, its own circumstances. And as long as you look at them like that, separately, you can still hold on to explanations. It's difficult, but possible. Then I laid the maps out side by side, and the explanations ran out. I started comparing parameters, not architecture, not finishing, bare numbers, burial depth, tunnel diameter, turn radii, distances between stations, things that, in theory, should be determined by local conditions, geology, development density, soil type. Each city has its own soil, its own rock, its own underground hydrology. Parameters should vary. They don't. The cross-sections of tunnels in Moscow, London, Paris, and Buenos Aires coincide within limits that an engineer would call statistically significant. The distances between stations, built in different decades on different continents, gravitate toward the same values. The radii of curves, the angles of inclination, the proportions of vaults. It's as if someone was working to a single specification, a standard that was never published, but to which everyone abides. Some might object that there are objective engineering limitations, that a train of a certain size requires a tunnel of a certain diameter, that physics is the same for everyone. I agree. But physics doesn't explain the similarities in parameters that don't depend on it. Physics doesn't dictate the depth of a station. It doesn't dictate the distance between stops. It doesn't dictate the shape of a vault, where a rectangular cross-section would be cheaper and simpler. And then I remembered what we've already discussed in this series, the land-based architecture of the 19th century. Colonnades, rotundas, identical facade solutions in cities separated by oceans. A single architectural code, which official history explains away as fashion, influence, and borrowing. Now I see the same code underground, the same repetition, the same inexplicable standardization, the same signature, emerging across different eras and different names on a map. Fashion can explain a facade. Fashion doesn't explain a tunnel 70 meters deep, the same cross-section as a tunnel on the other side of the planet. There's something I've been putting off for a long time because it requires caution. Not because the evidence is weak, but because it's so consistent, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't reading a pattern where there wasn't one. Now I'm convinced. In every major underground system in the world, there are spaces you can't access. Not because they're structurally dangerous, not because there's nothing to see in them, but because someone decided you don't want to go there. London. Dozens of closed stations. Aldwych, closed in 1994. Downstreet, closed in 1932. The British Museum, closed in 1933. The official reasons are low ridership and economic infeasibility, but some of these stations were handed over to the War Department and are still under its control. What exactly the War Department is doing with the abandoned 1920s platform is unclear. New York. When laying new lines, construction workers regularly stumble upon tunnels that don't correspond to any known plans. They're not marked on diagrams. They're not mentioned in the Transport Department's archives. Brickwork, the type of mortar and bond used, predates any documented underground structure in the city. They document them. Sometimes they photograph them. Then they fill them with concrete and continue their tunnel, as if nothing ever happened. Moscow. Metro 2, a name everyone knows, yet about which not a single official document exists. A deep-level system, parallel to the civilian metro, supposedly connecting government facilities. Journalists write about it. Former metro builders talk about it. Its existence is simultaneously semi-officially acknowledged and semi-officially denied. But even if we accept Metro 2 as a military installation of the Cold War, that doesn't explain the other things: the closed sections, the bricked-up branches, the ghost stations that appear on the walls of existing tunnels like the outlines of something that was there before. I'm not concerned about closed stations per se. Transportation systems change. Lines are rebuilt. Some are decommissioned. What worries me is the proportional nature of the reaction. If these are simply old platforms, simply outdated lines, simply utility cavities that have lost their function, then why the meter-thick concrete plugs? Why the guards at sites that are officially empty? Why the silence so dense that it becomes a structure, a form, a presence? Silence comes in different forms. There's the silence of emptiness, when there's truly nothing to talk about. And then there's the silence of wait, when nothing is said because saying anything would change too much. And every time I read yet another dry report about a sealed tunnel discovered during construction and filled with concrete without further study, I hear the second kind of silence. I hesitated for a long time to include what I'm about to say in this story, not because I consider it unimportant, but because this is the most treacherous territory I've ever tread. I'm warning you about this honestly, but I can't help but say it, because once I saw it, I couldn't stop noticing it. I'm talking about ornamentation, about those elements of metro stations that we perceive as decoration, as decor, as the architect's stylistic choice. I thought so too until I began to look at them as an engineer, not a passenger. On the ceilings of Moscow metro stations, there are metal rosettes of a strictly defined geometry, not arbitrary, not artistic, repeated with a mathematical precision that is unnecessary for decor. Copper and bronze elements are mounted in places where they serve no aesthetic function, behind columns, in technical niches, in places where passengers will never look. Why decorate something no one will see? Domed vaults at stations where a dome is structurally redundant. A flat ceiling would have been cheaper, simpler, and faster. But instead, spherical and parabolic forms emerged, the very forms that in physics are associated with the concentration and direction of energy. I recalled the above-ground architecture we've already discussed in this series: spires, cupolas, and metal caps of 19th century buildings, elements that a number of independent researchers interpret not as decorative, but as functional, components of a system whose operating principles we don't understand or don't want to understand. What if underground and above-ground architecture aren't two separate phenomena, but the upper and lower parts of a single structure? What if the domes above and the cupolas below aren't a coincidence of style, but a coincidence of function? What if what we call ornament is a language we've forgotten how to read? I'm not making a claim. I'm posing what I consider a legitimate question. If these elements are purely decorative, then why are they placed with an engineering rather than an artistic logic? If they are functional, then what function did the system of which they are a part serve? And if we don't know, then perhaps it's worth at least admitting that the underground palaces where we wait for the train weren't designed for trains. I want you to take a moment to look away from the tunnels and at the dates. Just the dates. Because it's here that these disparate observations begin to coalesce into a pattern I can't ignore, no matter how much I'd like to. Most of the world's largest subways were officially built within a narrow historical window, between 1,860 and 1,930. 70 years. In the span of history, a blink of an eye. And this is what happened in that same instant. Tartary disappears from the maps. The territory, charted in 18th century atlases and encyclopedias with the same certainty as France or Spain, simply ceases to exist. Not conquered, not renamed, erased. Maps are redrawn. Reference books are reprinted without mention. During this same period, newspaper reports on the discovery of giant skeletons, the very ones we spoke of earlier, cease. Reports that had been appearing for decades in the pages of respectable publications simply cease to exist. Uncontested, unexplored, abandoned. During this same period, the architecture of the old world ceases to be reproduced. Buildings that were still being erected in the mid-19th century, with colonnades, rotundas, and redundant foundations, are replaced by simplified designs. It's as if someone lost access to the technology or the blueprints, or as if the blueprints ran out and there was nothing left to build from them. Now add to this the subway. Underground systems of colossal scale, officially emerging precisely during this period. And ask yourself one question I've been asking myself every day since I saw this timeline in its entirety. If the above-ground infrastructure of a previous civilization could be appropriated, and we've seen how it's done, repaint the facade, change the sign, add the name of a new architect, move the date forward by half a century, then underground infrastructure is even easier to appropriate. Much easier, because no one sees it. It's underground. All you have to do is lay the tracks, put up the signs, install escalators, and say, "We built it." Who's going to check? Who's going to descend 80 meters and begin examining the masonry behind the cladding panels? Who's going to demand the construction logs, which by some strange coincidence have survived only in fragments or not at all? Who's going to ask the question that's not usually answered? I'm not saying the metro wasn't built in the 20th century. Some things were certainly built. Tracks were laid. Platforms were equipped. Electrical systems were installed. But there's a difference between someone who lays tracks in an existing tunnel and someone who created it. And I think we stopped noticing this difference right when the maps were redrawn. I want to pause for a moment, not to add new facts, there are plenty, but to look at what has already been collected from a different perspective. Because it's not the anomalies themselves that frighten me. What frightens me is what happens to them after they're discovered. Every time, the same sequence. So identical from case to case, from country to country, from decade to decade, that it itself becomes proof, not of a conspiracy, no. Something more subtle and perhaps more effective. Discovery, brief recording, reclassification, silence. The giant skeletons we discussed earlier in this series. Dozens of finds, documented in reputable newspapers, sent to the Smithsonian for study. The Institute today claims that such specimens are not in its collection. Lost. Not refuted. Lost. Buildings without building archives. Hundreds of buildings in dozens of cities, appearing in the historical record already completed, without photographs of scaffolding, without contracts, without design correspondence, attributed to famous architects based on circumstantial evidence. The matter is closed, unresolved, closed. And now the underground spaces, tunnels discovered during metro construction, older than the metro itself, chambers, cavities, galleries not envisaged by any known project, briefly described in engineering reports, filled with concrete. Construction continued, unexplored, walled up. Do you see the structure? I've been reluctant to name it for a long time, because a name makes it real, and the reality of this structure signifies things that are uncomfortable to think about. But I will name it, because it deserves a name. Passive erasure, not censorship. Censorship is when someone forbids you to speak. It is a blunt instrument. It leaves traces. It provokes resistance. Passive erasure works differently. No one forbids anything. No one is standing at the door ordering silence. Certain questions simply stop being asked. Certain findings stop being investigated. Certain coincidences stop being noticed. Not because someone high up gave the order, but because in academia, in the museum community, in engineering circles, An unspoken understanding is formed about which questions lead to grants, publications, and careers, while which ones lead to silence, to polite refusals, to a reputation as an eccentric. This isn't a conspiracy. It's the climate. It's the atmospheric pressure that you can't see, but which determines which way the water flows. And the water doesn't flow toward questions about who built the tunnels to the metro. It doesn't flow toward studying the masonry behind the cladding panels. It doesn't flow toward comparative analysis of underground cross-sections on different continents. It flows past, every time past, so reliably and so consistently that after 100 years, the absence of research begins to look like an answer. If no one has researched, then there is nothing to research. If no one has asked, then the question doesn't exist. This morning I went down into the metro, just like yesterday, just like 1,000 times before. I stepped onto the escalator, which took me down for almost 3 minutes, and for the first time in a long time, I tried to look at it with the eyes of someone seeing everything for the first time. 3 minutes down. 3 minutes of continuous descent into a depth that most passengers don't realize because they're staring at their phones. I wasn't looking at my phone. I was looking at the walls, at the vault that began at the top and followed me all the way down, like the throat of a huge stone creature, at the marble that lay so tightly and so evenly that you couldn't fit a blade between the slabs, at the bronze lamps, each one weighing more than I do, at the mosaic assembled from thousands of pieces of smalt by the hands of artisans whose official history cannot name. I stepped out onto the platform and stood in the center of the hall. The ceiling above me rose about 8 meters. The columns on either side were spaced at a distance that had nothing to do with structural necessity. The proportions of the hall were such that voices faded before reaching the walls, in the same way modern acoustics reproduce with computer models. There were people standing next to me. Hundreds of people. They were waiting for the train. None of them looked up. None of them touched the marble. No one asked why a transport hub looked like a space designed for something immeasurably greater than the movement of bodies from point to point. And I understand them. I was like that myself for most of my life. I descended, rode, and ascended. The marble was the background. Depth was a given. Scale was the norm. Because this was the only metro I knew. I had nothing to compare it to, nothing to be surprised by. Surprise requires distance, and distance requires knowledge of what can be different. Now I know. I know that tunnels at this depth are excessive for transport, that official construction deadlines do not stand up to arithmetic verification, that the technologies used to create these spaces emerged in their final form with no documented evolution, that extensive underground systems existed beneath the world's cities long before anyone decided to run trains through them, that the parameters of these systems coincide across different continents with a precision that cannot be explained by fashion or parallel development, that closed stations are guarded with a seriousness disproportionate to their declared emptiness, that every anomaly discovered over a century and a half of underground construction has followed the same path: recording, classification, oblivion. I know all this, and I cannot stop knowing. The train arrived. The doors opened. I boarded the carriage and rode through a tunnel that is perhaps older than the country I am in, through a tunnel whose walls remember other builders, whose vaults were designed for different loads, whose function, perhaps, had nothing in common with what we use it for today. Stone does not forget. This is the only thing I am certain of after all have found. People forget, archives burn, documents get lost, maps get redrawn. But the stone, laid in a certain way, at a certain depth, with a certain precision, remains. It does not argue, does not prove, does not convince. It simply lies where hands we know nothing about placed it, and waits for someone to look at it closely enough. We descend every morning. We pass by, we move on, and we do not ask the question that lies beneath our feet. Who built this? When? Why? And what else is hidden in these depths? Walled up, renamed, appropriated, and forgotten, awaiting not discovery, but simply an honest look.